a PowerPoint that will help you remember and identify the steps that you need to take in this project. The objectives of this project is for you to identify correct uses of morphology, syntax, and semantics, describe these correct uses using the appropriate terminology. I also want you to identify and explain the incorrect uses of morphology, syntax, and semantics. So here's an example of a written language excerpt that was written by an English language learner. You will be given an example, an excerpt, and that excerpt will have the letter A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, or I. Okay, I'm going to use this as an example so that I can sort of model to you what you should be doing as you prepare for this project. So this is my sample. I'm going to read it. In the weekend, I go to the park with my parents and two sisters. We eat a lot of food and played football. The sun was hot and I don't wear nothing, so I got burned. My dad cooked meat with papa on barbecue for lunch and I ate so much. It was delicious. So let's start looking at the sample for morphemes. Remember, and this is actually a slide that I took straight from the morpheme PowerPoint, where at the end of the session I talk about what you need to be looking for in terms of accomplishments and challenges. Okay, so when you're analyzing the sample for morphemes, remember to look for examples of the derivational morphemes, like full, eyes, limen. These are the morphemes, the suffixes that change the part of speech of the word. Okay, then you want to look for the inflectional morphemes, and those are those 6, right, that change it for tense, for person, for gender, for degree, for case, and for verb usage. And then here are some of the adjectives and terminology you should use when describing what you find above. So remember morpheme placement, prefix or suffix. Remember to describe the characteristics of the morphemes, like if they're free or bound. And the characteristics of the word, as if they're simple or complex. You also want to reference the type of morpheme, whether it's derivational or inflectional, and then use all of that information together so that it sounds something like the morpheme ly that changes the part of speech from an adjective to an adverb. Okay, same thing with inflectional. The morpheme s, and you would say the suffix, right, s, that modifies the word by number. Again, if you have any questions about this, I would strongly encourage you to go back to the morphology PowerPoint and video, watch it again in several different places, just to remind you of all of these different aspects. Okay, so we take our written language sample, okay, and now what our focus is to look for the accomplishments in terms of morphology. So if we go through, we find that these are the accomplishments, okay, so parents, food, played, the sun was, I got, my dad cooked lunch, I ate, it was, and delicious. So look at parents. We know that this is an accomplishment in terms of morphology because the child, the English language learner, correctly added that s, right, that inflectional suffix to modify for number onto the noun parent to showcase sort of plurality, right, more than one parent. And here I give you a little write-up of the way that I would describe that. The child showed knowledge of inflectional, and I would say the child showed correct knowledge of inflectional morphology in his addition of the inflectional suffix s to the noun parent to modify it for number and to correctly signify multiple parents. Okay? And again, you can use this example as a model for how you would write and you would describe and determine the accomplishments. Let me talk about food. So here I say the child correctly neglects to add the inflectional suffix s on this non-count noun, which does not require an s to suggest more plurality. Or more food, right? To suggest more food, more than one type of food. Here's another one. For played. The child showed that he was able to correctly conjugate the verb play in simple past tense form by adding the inflectional suffix ed. Okay, so notice that I've bolded inflectional suffix, modify, inflectional suffix s, plurality, conjugate, simple past tense form, ed. Those items that I've bolded are the terminology that is important that you include. Okay, so once you've done the accomplishments, and remember in that first essay, you are talking about all of the accomplishments of morphology that you see in that written language sample. For the challenges, what you're doing is you're trying to find one, okay? But what I'm going to ask you to do for the workshop this week is to find three examples that you feel comfortable with, and then from that, I'm going to have you choose one of those, okay? But for the project, remember in that second essay where you're talking about the challenges, you are selecting one error for morphology, one error for semantics, one error for syntax. That's if you have 3 group members, right? If you have 2 group members, then you're choosing between the 3 and doing just 2, right? Either morphology and syntax, or morphology and semantics, or syntax and semantics. Okay, and you're choosing one error for each of them. Okay, so same writing example. Here we see the following errors in morphology. So we see goad, sister, because it's supposed to be plural, because there's 2. We eat, which was supposed to be in past tense. I don't, which is supposed to be in past tense. I didn't. And then I got burn, which was also supposed to be in past tense, burned. Okay, so let me show you what it would sound like when you describe the error here. The child made an error by adding the inflectional suffix ed to the irregular verb go to indicate past simple tense, goed, instead of using the irregular past simple form of went. Okay, so notice how I'm using the terms irregular. That's very important in this particular example because go is an irregular verb, and that's why it doesn't take that ed form. It actually has its own unique word, went. Here's another example. Sister. The child made an error by neglecting to add the inflectional suffix s to the noun sister to indicate plurality and that there was more than one sister. Let me show you an example for we eat. The child incorrectly used the simple present tense form of the irregular verb eat instead of conjugating the irregular verb to its past simple form ate. So these examples that you see would be the first statement that you give after you present the example that you're going to analyze. And after that, you would cite the standard American English rule that's been broken. And then after that, you would go into giving me the analysis based on their theory. Remember, today we are only focusing on that first part where you are choosing the error, and just selecting the error, and then describing why the error. Okay? We're not going to go over you presenting the rule and presenting that third part in the second essay. Okay, so what to analyze for syntax? Again, this comes straight from the syntax PowerPoint. You remember that you're looking for noun phrases, verb phrases, prepositional phrases, if the student is able to use all 3. If the phrases are quite complex, meaning that it includes many words in each phrase. So like in a noun phrase, it would include an adjective, for example. If the words are written in the right order, as in subject, verb, object order. And if it includes all of the components that it should include, right? So if we're talking about a noun phrase that has a noun that needs an article, we should expect that that article, like the, would be there. Here's some of the challenges that you can look into. If the child doesn't actually use prepositional phrases pretty often, that's something that you could talk about. If phrases are quite simple or do not include necessary words. If words are written in the wrong order, and if the phrases don't include all of the components. Also, you want to look for the construction of auxiliary, modal, and lexical verbs. So remember we went over the different tenses of the verbs, right? Present progressive, past progressive, present perfect, past perfect, and modal usage. So in constructing these types of verbs, you have to use auxiliary or modal verbs. And so you want to look out for that if the child is able to do it correctly or not. Okay, and then we want to talk about formation of statements. So either negative statements or questions. Okay, so if the child is able to transform their positive statement to the negative statement or to a question appropriately, where you now have all of the correct words included, that would include auxiliary words like did. Remember how we went over questions with do you read books? Or a question word question like what books do you read? Okay, So again, here's our written language sample. When we look at it for syntax, I see the following things that are accomplishments that are done correctly. I goed to the park. So the first one, notice how goad is wrong, right? We've talked about that in morphology. Now, even though that is an error in morphology, in syntax, remember that our eye is looking at something different. We're looking at phrases. We're looking at the placement of words in a particular order. And we see that even though goad, the morphology is wrong in that word, that phrase, I go to the park, is correct because it's in the right order, right? It goes subject, I, verb, goad, and then object to the park. To the park also being a prepositional phrase. Okay, and here are the other ones. With my parents and two sister, so I got burned. With Papa on barbecue for lunch, it was delicious. So let me talk through a couple of these. So for the first one, I would write something like, the child shows knowledge of the correct word order in English of subject, verb, object order with his use of I, subject, goad, verb, to the park, object. Okay, and notice how I pinpoint out with the example and I tell you the subject, the verb, and the object, and I tell you what words those are in the sentence. It's really important that you do that you're very explicit with your examples, because that tells me that you understand the content. Let's look at the second one. Let's look at another aspect of the first one. The child also shows knowledge of how to formulate prepositional phrases, as he writes to the park, starting with the correct preposition to, and places this after the verb goad of this sentence. Okay, so that's another aspect that I'm commenting about. The second one, the child showed knowledge of how to use and place the conjunction and as a way to connect noun phrases, such as in a statement, my parents, which is the noun, and, which is the conjunction, to sister, which is the noun. So notice here how I'm pinpointing the word order and placement of the conjunction. Even though to sister is wrong, it's wrong in morphology. It's not wrong in syntax. Okay. So I got burned. I would highlight the conjunction so. With Papa, it would be a prepositional phrase I could talk about. As same thing with on barbecue. For lunch would be another prepositional phrase I can talk about. And it was delicious. I could talk about the placement of subject, verb, and object. Let's look at the challenges of syntax. Here are two. Okay, so in the weekend, and I don't wear nothing. And actually there's another one that I just realized. On barbecue, you see it listed right here, on barbecue. Here you could talk about the accomplishments in terms of the preposition coming before the noun, on. Okay, but it also represents an error in that the child forgot to insert the article, the, before the noun, barbecue, right? So that's what you could talk about as a challenge in syntax. Here's some other ones. In the weekend, the child made an error by using the preposition in instead of the preposition on at the beginning of the prepositional phrase. So here we see the wrong preposition selected. For I don't wear nothing. Here we can see a double negative going on, right? In sort of the correct version would be I don't wear anything. And here we see the child using I don't wear nothing. So this is how you would go about describing it. The child made an error by using the negative term nothing with the negative form of the statement I don't, which elicits an incorrect double negative form. Instead, the child should have used the term anything, which would have resulted in a single form of negation in the statement. Okay, and then last but not least, we have semantics. Remember that for the accomplishments, what we're looking at is the meaning of the words. If the words that have been chosen represent the correct denotation or connotation, if they have multiple meanings but are used in the correct way, that shows pretty sophisticated semantic knowledge on the part of the English language learner. Words that represent reference correctly and sense correctly. So you could look for nouns that don't necessarily have a referent, right, but they have a sense, and we know that those are more difficult for English language learners. So you can talk about that, the fact that the child used it correctly. In terms of challenges, what you're looking for are words that do not reflect the actual meaning that was intended by the child. So let's say that the child used a word And you sort of understand the idea that they're trying to communicate, but you notice that that word choice was not as appropriate as it could have been. For example, words that are either too general or too specific with regards to what the child actually means. So let's go through an example. Again, here's our writing sample. Here are all the accomplishments, and notice how many there are in semantics, right? Weekend, park, parents, sister, food, sun, hot, burn, meat, barbecue, lunch, and delicious. All of these have been chosen because what they do is they reflect the actual intended meaning of the child. So the child chose an appropriate word to describe their meaning for each of these cases. And here's an example of how you can go about describing that. So for the first example, weekend, the child uses the term weekend appropriately to reference Saturday and Sunday and a time when he would be able to go to the park with his family. The child understands this word and how to use it appropriately because he's able to put it in the right, sort of reference the idea of what we do at the end of the week, right? Where we have a vacation, where you can spend time with family, etc. Let's look at the word hot. The child uses the correct term, burn. Burn to describe what happens to his skin when he's in the sun for too long. Considering that this may be described differently in other languages, right? It may not be a simple translation. He shows knowledge of the right term and how to use it correctly in English. And the last one, let's look at barbecue. The child uses the word barbecue correctly to refer to grilling food and meat. Since this is a particularly American term, his use of the word showcases his developing English knowledge as well as his developing American cultural knowledge. So that is something else that you can go and do, is look through your written language sample and see if there are any words that are particularly American or are indicative of specific cultural items from America. Because that really shows you insight into what the child can do and what the child knows. So let's look at the challenges of semantics. I have a couple listed here. Football, nothing, cooked, and papa. So football, the child used the term football to refer to the sport of soccer, which has a different term in English. This shows that he is still developing his knowledge of the different names for similar concepts across languages and countries. Okay? So by football, what he meant was soccer. Right? He did not mean football as in the American version that we think about. Football is the term that is used in other countries, Spanish, for example. Also in English-speaking countries like South Africa, football means soccer. Okay. Nothing. The child used the term nothing in place of a more specific vocabulary, such as saying sunscreen, which he was indirectly referring to. And the part in which I'm talking about of the example is, I don't wear nothing, so I got burned. Right? So nothing wasn't the most appropriate choice for the child to make. He could have been more explicit if he had used the term sunscreen. And that's what I'm referring to in my write-up. What would have been more appropriate for him to use in its place would have been the term sunscreen, although one is able to understand his general meaning. Okay, so that's the sort of way that you would go about discussing the challenges for semantics. I also want to give you a very important tip and hint. You should not be basing your analysis on spelling. Okay, there are a couple of different words that are spelled wrong, incorrectly in this sample. For example, delicious. Delicious is spelled with a U at the ending. It's C-I-O-U-S. But the child spelled it wrong. That is not what you're going to focus on. You're not going to focus on incorrect spelling. Okay, that's why I've given you the transcript along sort of my written translation of what the child has written, so that you don't focus on the spelling mistakes. Okay, the third one, cooked, would be an error because a more appropriate term that could be used would be grilled. And then papa is wrong because it's a Spanish word for potato. And so he meant to say potato, maybe he didn't know the term, but he used papa instead. which represents a semantic challenge that you can talk about. Remember, for the challenges, you are choosing one, but for the workshop that I'm going to have you do this week, you are going to highlight 3 for me, so that you have a choice between those, and then you're going to settle for 1. Okay, so again, the objectives of this week's session was for you to be able to identify the correct uses of the morphology, syntax, and semantics subsystems. I also wanted you to be able to describe the correct uses of these subsystems. I then wanted you to identify incorrect uses and also be able to describe those incorrect uses. Okay? Hopefully you'll be able to do that given what we've covered over the last couple of weeks, and also based on the examples that I've given you in this PowerPoint, which should serve as models for you as you go about that task.